To another edition of Off to Tube, AP European History Distance Learning, and welcome to the Off to Garage. As you have a daughter who's sleeping upstairs and a wife who's doing things inside the house, you need to find some sort of space in order to record these videos. So we're getting creative here. So welcome to another part of the Off to Home. It's wonderful to be broadcasting to each and every one of you today. I hope you're enjoying your day. I hope you're having some fun with your family. Hope you've been outside at some point today. And here we go. So as we left Europe last week, we saw that the dramatic changes that were coming from industrialization really clashed with the conservative order of most of the monarchs of Europe, and we saw that all of the shifts and changes that were happening really bubbled up into a head, and yet again we have another wave of revolutions across Europe, starting of course with France, because what's European history without the French being rabble rousers? And so you get the Second French Revolution, and then again a Third French Revolution, which then sparks revolutions in Prussia and Germany, in Austria and in Italy and in Spain. And so we see another wave of these revolutions really threatening to change Europe and causing people to realize like things are happening. And so when we left the revolutions of 1848, what we really realized is that not much changed. In fact, so you have these revolutions that were inspired by liberal ideas, some who were fighting for working class rights, others who were trying to create new nations and inspired by nationalism. And in these, essentially what happened is each of these ideas wound up competing with each other and were unable to actually overthrow the conservative monarchies of Europe. So really when we get to the revolutions of 1848, yet again, things don't really change. And so we come to 1840, and it's really a turning point for Europe in the 19th century, and especially a turning point for these conservative monarchs, because they've realized something, and they're thinking, you know what? Things are shifting. We can't keep doing what we did. We actually can't go back to the way things was. Now, this is, of course, incredibly symbolic, as you see Clemens von Metternich running away and resigning and literally fleeing Austria because of his unpopular conservative policies. And so clearly something has to shift in the way that European governments are going to maintain power. If these conservative governments are going to keep revolutions from happening again, they're going to have to shift. So in a sense, when we get to the second half of the 19th century, and particularly the 1848 to about 1871, I mean, this is a time where European monarchs gotta keep it real. They got to get real. This is going to be the era of realism. And so I'm going to go to our presentation here, because it's going to take a little bit of discussion in order to understand what we mean by keeping it real. So again, 1848 to 1871, this is the era of realism. And this is where those radical ideologies that we saw happening in the beginning of the 19th century are going to shift. And you're going to see the radical ideology shifting. You're going to see monarchies shifting their policies in order to try and utilize some of those radical ideologies in order to maintain authority. It's really an interesting time where people are looking at how do we practically get things done? How do we either A, practically bring about change, like we're about to talk about, or how do we practically maintain power and deal with all of the issues and changes that are arising with rapid industrialization? So to start out, I figured it'd be fun to really just start out with a more revolutionary idea, and that's Marxism. Now, I know what you're thinking. When you're thinking about Karl Marx, especially those of you who are probably closer to the liberal perspective, the more conservative perspective, or even just somebody who was born and raised in the America, Marxism is a dirty word in the United States. I mean, communism, ooh, it's this freaky thing. And especially when people think about communism, well, they think of like, oh, it's head in the clouds. That'll never work. But in 1848, this was a thinker's way of modifying the ideas of socialism to say, hey, something needs to be more scientific here. There needs to be a practical way for the ideas of socialism to actually make a difference. We can't just be the utopian thinkers of before. We need to actually think about how these changes are going to come about. So while some of these changes that we're going to talk about may seem a little head in the clouds, maybe they don't seem like, or at least when we look at as an afterthought, Perhaps it wasn't as practical as once thought. But again, this is part of getting real. And this really starts with the leaders of the communist movement. That's going to be Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Now, these aren't the first communists, but these are two individuals who are largely responsible for popularizing the idea. Both are going to be middle-class individuals. In fact, Karl Marx was a university student who wanted to be a romantic writer. He wanted to be an author. He wanted to, enjoy nature and really search for the emotions of things. And his parents, like many of your parents would, said, well, that's not a practical thing. So they took him out of the university he was in and put him in a different university and said, you're going to get a practical education. Well, what wound up happening is Karl Marx began to discuss more radical ideas with other socialists and began to join a league of people who were fighting for these ideals, and he becomes kind of the author of this Communist Manifesto. Now, Friedrich Engels, also a bourgeois, and in fact, Friedrich Engels is the one that I prefer to talk about because it's really interesting to look at how his journey towards socialism and eventually communism really starts with a spanking, and that's because his father was a middle-class merchant. He was a store owner, and one of the first instances where Engels really started questioning the liberal ideology of laissez-faire and all those things was when he was working in his dad's shop, and a customer asked him about a certain product, and he actually told the customer, no, you don't want that one is faulty. And his dad took him out back and spanked him and said, it's the customer's job to do that. It's not your job to be the person selling it. Essentially, his dad wanted to sell the faulty product because that's what you do. Everybody looks out for their own self-interest. Well, then Engels, of course, is also going to be well-versed in and somebody who travels around and sees firsthand some of the issues for the working class. And he's going to write about the poor working conditions, the poor living conditions. And he's somebody who is fervently believing that the lower class needs to have more rights and more protections. And so both of these individuals become radicalized, and they are going to create the ideology of communism. And this comes out of as a modification of socialism. Again, this is the era of realism. This is when you have to really think about things scientifically and find some sort of practical way to get what you want. So when we look at the modification of socialism, Karl Marx especially was a student of the philosopher Hegel, and Hegel believed that the history of the world was cyclical, and that essentially, not that history repeats itself, but there are these certain patterns within history. Everything that happens has some sort of seed of something that happened before it, and so Hegel believed that if we can just figure out what that cycle is, then you could actually begin to make real change. And so Karl Marx believes that he found the key. And Karl Marx says, he looks at history and he says, well, you know what, the cycle of the world is really class warfare. I mean, really, and even for those of you that took AP World History, since the agricultural revolution, there really is this haves versus the have-nots, and it starts out with the people who have fertile agricultural land and the people who don't, who are then forced to work on that agricultural land. And for Marx, a student of European history, that's the feudal order that was. And then over time, those who are in the lower class realize how awful their lives are. Maybe that's a slave revolt, maybe that's a peasant revolt, and then periodically they rise up and they kill the rich, and then they become the ruling class. And then that ruling class creates a whole new group of people who they are going to oppress and essentially build their wealth off of. And Karl Marx, again, got to remember, this is somebody who grew up with the French Revolution and then lived and was around during the Second French Revolution and these revolutions of 1848. And so what Marx is looking at and saying is that, hey, there's going to be, the French Revolution was another example of that popular revolt. You had the bourgeoisie who were not given the same rights as the second estate and the nobility. So what did they do? They rose up, they cut their heads off in the French Revolution, and they became the ruling class. And he looked at industrialization and the changes that were coming about, and he realized, well, hey, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, they are the new ruling elites. And who are they oppressing and building their wealth off of? Well, it's the proletariat. It's the working class. And so what Karl Marx believed is that it's the working class that's going to come about and eventually is going to rise up. Well, first they're going to identify as a class. He's going to create this kind of class consciousness, this thing that the bourgeoisie were already developing. The working class was starting to develop it. We see it a little bit in artisans. It's not necessarily as widespread, and it certainly doesn't go across national boundaries, but Karl Marx believed that the proletariat must identify as a class all across Europe. The class should be their primary identity, and eventually they're going to rise up together, kill the bourgeoisie, take their property. And then they need to create what he calls the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, those are interesting words to be using when you're trying to create positive change and overthrow conservative monarchies and conservative systems. But what he means by dictatorship of the proletariat is essentially breaking that cycle. Instead of creating a new class to which the proletariat would then oppress and then build their wealth off of, what he wants is a classless society where each individual not only works for their own benefit, but also works for the benefit of all. And so, what does this dictatorship of the proletariat mean? Well, the first step you need to do is you need to redistribute all the wealthy land. People need to have access to the things that they need, right? So it's not the Charles Fourier little phalansteries or Robert Owen just waiting for the businessmen to make the shifts, right? This is now the practical, the proletariat. Here are the steps that you have to take. Let's get real here, right? How do we actually change this system? So you need to redistribute all the wealthy land. You're essentially abolishing private property in that sense. You're going to centralize the economy. That means centralizing all money in banks and factories. All are going to be under the control of the government. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, what do you mean? A government? That means there's some sort of ruling class. Yes, but this is a classless society where everybody is working with their own strengths to help the greater community as a whole, hence the word communism. So those who are working in the government are not necessarily better than anybody who's working in a factory in a field or producing or doing things with their hands or farming, right? They're just using their skills of organization in order to help. And so if you are skilled in accounting and counting money and arithmetic and calculus, as 90% of you are taking that AP exam, if that's your forte, then yes, you should be working in the banks. If you're like me and really you just love to work with your back and just work hard and sweat for absolutely no reason, well, then they'd probably put me in a factory and say, just work your tail off and produce some good things. But again, all of that is going to be controlled by what the masses need. That's what the centralization of the economy means. It's be scientific, be practical. What does society need? All of society should then work to produce that need. A really important thing is everybody has to work. There is no freeloading, right? That's one of the biggest criticisms of communism is that, well, everybody just gets lazy because we all just give up. There's no motivation to get better and to improve, which I'm not saying is necessarily a wrong critique. But again, Karl Marx is trying to create this completely vast new system that is going to radically change the way that European society and therefore American society, but European or Western society is organized. And part of that is that everybody needs to do their part. And that means absolutely everybody. So you need to force everybody to work. And then lastly, you need to have a system of free education, because if the masses aren't educated, then there's going to be some who, of course, are going to be ruling over the others. If everybody is educated, and everybody is educated in an equal way, well, great. And everybody has access to that education, then great. Nobody can then be taken advantage of. Remember, many people in the working class were still getting an education, but that doesn't necessarily mean that literacy rates during this time period were 100%. Right? We live in a society where literacy is pretty widespread, but at this point in European society, that is not the case yet. And so education and access to education was still something that was for the elites and especially for the bourgeoisie. And so again, this free education. So this whole system, again, is supposed to take the ideas of socialism out of its utopian roots and say, no. This is what practically has to happen. We've taken a scientific theory of the history of the world is this way. Then in order to break that cycle, we then need to do these things. So Karl Marx and communism is part of this era of realism. Now, again, you're going to be studying and reading about Karl Marx and how he dedicates his life, and Engels as well, too. and how he dedicates his life in order to try and helping the working class identify as a group. Now, Marx is going to be wrong with that. That's going to be the biggest issue with it, because Marx's ideas are going to then take a backseat to another one of these radical ideas that I'm about to talk about. Not yet. We still have one more to talk about, because your classmates would be very upset if I didn't mention a second realist alternative, and that is anarchism, which is going to be popularized by a man named Pierre Proudhon, who is a French anarchist who really comes up with this crazy idea, and Karl Marx is obviously going to agree with it, but it's also a different modification of socialism, in that, again, abolish private property. Because according to Proudhon, property has caused the need for any sort of social institutions. Because we have private property, that causes competition for property, for resources. Competition causes conflict. How do you solve conflict? Well, you create social systems. You create social institutions. And since these social institutions throughout Europe have also caused despotism, they have taken away individual liberty and freedom. You can see the Enlightenment values again coming through here. Then the only way that you can preserve liberty is to eliminate private property. And this is a modification of communism. Again, he believes that there shouldn't even be this government of dictatorship. There shouldn't be those systems. Those systems are useless. If humans are living in these small little communities, then things are going to work out without having to have these social institutions that are eventually going to lead to despotism. And so Proudhon and original anarchists are actually going to be fairly peaceful individuals. Now, there's going to be Mikhail Bakunin in Russia, who's going to take the ideas of anarchism and are actually going to create it to be much more radical. And that's where you see, especially in Russia, but all across Europe, and even a little bit in the United States as well, you see anarchist plots threatening the power of governments, in some cases actually assassinating political officials. But anarchism starts as actually a less extreme ideology. I mean, extreme in its thoughts, but not extreme in its actions. But I just think this picture here is absolutely perfect for anarchism. I mean, look at him. This guy just wants to challenge everything. He doesn't even sit in a chair the right way, right? He's the A.C. Slater of radical thinkers in the 19th century. He's the cool kid in the class, right? He starts out with his neck beard, and then he finishes it off, and he's got his cool hipster glasses and his long hair, and he doesn't sit in a chair traditionally. He turns the chair around and really has a real All right, you guys are still trying to figure out who A.C. Slater is, and I guess that shows my age, but that's fine. So then we get to nationalism. Now, nationalism is one of those ideologies that developed in the beginning of the 19th century, and in fact actually has its roots, nationalism kind of in some senses has its roots all the way back to the 100 Years' War with Britain and France, and what is British and what is French, and there's a little bit of that identity that comes about. But nationalism is going to really emerge when it comes to the French Revolution, and especially the French developed their own national consciousness around revolution, around changing things, around building a new society, about trying to make a more perfect society through popular revolt. And then, of course, as Napoleon trances across Europe, you have Germans and Austrians and others, and Egyptians especially too, but others around Europe, and Italians and Spanish saying, "Wait, what is this croissant eating Corsican with a funny accent? He's kind of short. What is he doing ruling over us? I'm German. I like schnitzel. I like beer. I don't necessarily enjoy wine, bread, cheese, and I certainly don't like snails. So why is this French Catholic trying to rule over me, a German Protestant? It doesn't make sense. That isn't popular sovereignty." And so you see nationalism developing after Napoleon. That's one of Napoleon's legacies. And nationalism is going to develop throughout the 19th century, but we're going to see how nationalism is going to be used actually as a tool as we get to our next section. But first, what is nationalism? Now, nationalism is when your political loyalty, right, your political identity rests in your community of a shared culture. Right? Essentially, a government should represent the people. Therefore, the government should share a same language, ethnicity, religion, customs. They should look like the people, act like the people, believe the people, and speak like the people. It should be a representation of what the people are. So then, what does that mean? And what's really interesting about nationalism is when you talk about nationalism, it seems like it's this grassroots movement. right? It seems like people could become have this consciousness of who we are. Now, remember, European identity has had a variety of different things. European identity was I'm Roman, I'm this, I'm Vandal, I'm Saxon, I am now Frank. What am I? I'm a peasant. Oh, and now I'm a Christian. Oh, that's my thing. I'm a Christian. Oh, now I'm a Catholic. Now I'm a Protestant. Now I'm part of the French state. L'état c'est moi. And now you're going to get this idea of really a nation being kind of all of those shared values and history that you have in people in a specific geographic area. But what's really interesting is that nationalism, especially in the 19th century, is not totally a grassroots movement. It is a little bit. But what we wind up seeing is we actually see governments taking intentional steps to stoke and build nationalism. So when we look at the second half of the 19th century, you're really looking at each of these places building a nation, saying, here is what it means to be British. Here is what it means to be French. Here's what it means to be German as we get to it. Here's what it means to be Austrian, kind of. Here's what it means to be Italian. So how does this happen? Well, this is actually really fun to think about. I wish we had more time to really look at a bunch of primary documents on this, because building nationalism is fascinating. I mean, one of the first things that governments do is they're going to do it through the promotion of a single language for an entire state. Now, that sounds pretty obvious to us, right? We take Spanish class because that's what people from Spain speak, and then of course Spanish colonies and yada yada. But you take French class. Why? Because that's what the French speak. If you go into an Italian restaurant, the menu is sometime in Italian. But here's the crazy thing. Most people in Italy during the 19th century didn't speak Italian. In fact, it was a small minority. People spoke regional dialects that sounded very different to what Italian is. And the same thing with Norwegian, same thing with Swedish. I mean, it's all of the European countries actually had to build these languages that we sort of take for granted today. And so this is where you see grammar schools developing. This is where you see dictionaries coming about, and dictionaries, specific words in specific languages, things that were supposed to be promoted and used. This is where you get national anthems that come about in order to promote this idea. One of my favorite ways of building nationalism is through the spreading of folk stories. Right? What are our folk histories? What are the stories that we've been telling our children for years and years and years? And now these get written down, and a lot of these things are the ones that you know. Right? Many Disney movies are based off of the folk stories of Hans Christian Andersen or the Brothers Grimm. Right? Hansel and Gretel, those things. Frozen is a Hans Christian Andersen story called The Ice Queen. Very different in Hans Christian Andersen's version. Very different. Certainly not the Elsa. But again, these folk stories are part of building that national identity. And then of course there's also the promotion of specific religions. Religions are going to play. Protestantism, Catholicism, Orthodoxy. These are all going to play as a part of building what a nation is. And so what's interesting about nationalism is it starts as a grassroots movement, but then it becomes a tool of governments in order to maintain authority and in order to try and stoke competition between other European powers. And so what the rest of our talk is going to be about, it's all together. Oh, well, that's fine. What the rest of this talk is going to be about is how two places are actually going to build the nations that didn't exist. Right? Because at the beginning of the 19th century, we see the Congress of Vienna really trying to maintain that balance of power between the five major powers of Europe. That's, of course, Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Right? They don't want Spain or Italy to unify, and Spain to gain power, Italy to unify. There are intentional steps taken in order to make sure that the Prussians do not gain much power. That's really why Poland was created and Belgium was created. So there's these intentional steps to try and maintain this balance of power. But what we see are individual politicians within Italy and in Germany. They're going to stoke nationalism in various ways in order to then create new nations, which are going to completely upset the balance of power, specifically after 1848, when you see the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe no longer playing its role. And so let's start with Italy and Italian unification. It's a good. So the aftermath of 1848. Again, you saw these Italian movements trying to overthrow Austrian control of Italy in the revolutions of 1848. But again, the revolutions of 1848 maintained that Austria still has control over Italy. However, you still have those secret societies that are trying to stoke nationalist sentiment, saying no, Italy needs to be its own thing. It needs to throw off all of these oppressors. It can't be all of these different independent kingdoms. If you come together as one, you can throw the Austrians out, you can throw the French out, you can put the Pope back in his place, you can actually get an Italy run by the people. And when we look at the different kingdoms, it's the kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia that's going to be the most capable of stoking nationalism and building a nation. And that's really because in the north of Italy, you're going to see that compared to the rest of Italy, they're going to be the most economically stable, they're going to be the most industrialized, they're going to be the ones that are going to at least somewhat have an economic advantage over the others. And this is going to be especially prominent when you see Count Cavour being named Prime Minister of Piedmont Sardinia. And it's Cavour who is going to use this idea of realism. And I guess I should take a step back here. Both of these examples are going to be ways of politicians using what is known as realpolitik, or realpolitik, in order to practically achieve whatever aim that they have. Now, realpolitik is going to be something especially promoted by Otto von Bismarck in our next slide, but you're going to see Cavour uses it. When you're reading your section on chapter 22 and 23, you're going to see the British using it, you're going to see the French using it, Napoleon III, you are going to see all individuals, all monarchies are going to start practicing this realpolitik, this using practical measures in order to gain what you want. And so to give just some examples of that with Italy, well, one of the first things that Cavour wants to do is, well, he wants to get the Austrians out. He wants to gain more territory for Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia to start to build this Italian nation. And so he goes to Napoleon III. Napoleon III, who he knows wants to have an expansive empire, wants to make France once again a dominant power in Europe. Remember, after the First French Revolution, France was kind of still licking its wounds. And so he knows Napoleon III wants to restore French greatness. And so he creates this agreement and says, if you help us out with the Austrians, if you fight with us with the Austrians, then we'll give you Nice and Savoy. We'll give you some territory that Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia has. You'll also get to have we'll create this central Italian kingdom in which your nephew Napoleon can be ruling as long as he marries the King of Piedmont and Sardinia's daughter. And so there's a marriage alliance that's a part of it. And then Cavour goes and instigates a war with Austria. He starts a war in which France then comes to Piedmont Sardinia's aid. But because of Napoleon's realpolitik, he realizes, well, if I continue this war, we may have beaten the Austrians now, but Austria can still fight, and I need to focus on other things. And so France actually backs out of the agreement, which infuriates Cavour and Victor Emmanuel of Piedmont and Sardinia. And so while that necessarily fails, Cavour actually gets lucky, because you wind up seeing nationalist movements holding plebiscites. Remember those plebiscites, kind of votes of the plebs, of the common people, and they actually choose to join the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia in northern Italy. And again, France still gets Nice and Savoy because Napoleon III agrees to recognize those annexations in return. So again, you see both Napoleon III practicing realpolitik, but also Cavour saying, hey, all right, we win on this and we'll still give you Nice and Savoy as long as you recognize it. Well, at the same time that all this is happening, you see another figure. He's a bright orange fish in the state fish of California, and that's Garibaldi, Giuseppe Garibaldi. And Garibaldi is one of those fascinating figures, a student of Mazzini, who was a nationalist in the beginning of the 19th century during the original kind of movements for Italian unification. He's somebody who believes in building this nation. He's going to do it starting with Sardinia, and eventually then they're going to move on to mainland Italy and start taking Naples and Sicily. They're going to march towards Rome, and him and his red shirts, get it, because they literally wore red shirts, are going to be marching towards Rome and starting to build this this nation of Italy. Now, here's the deal. Cavour and Garibaldi, they have this vision of a unified Italy, but they have very different visions for it. Garibaldi, the nationalist grassroots fighter that he wants a democratic republic. He wants something where the common person, universal suffrage, voting for a republic. Cavour, well, of course, Cavour has gotten his power from a kingdom, so he wants a constitutional monarchy. And so they both are going to disagree. And so as Garibaldi is marching towards Rome, that's when Cavour is going to start to throw his weight around the kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. What winds up happening is, as the two are kind of meeting together in the middle, you then see the plebiscites going in the favor of Piedmont, Sardinia. Garibaldi retires, goes back to his farm, and I guess lives his peaceful life, which just sounds awesome. Like, how great is that? Yet another wonderful Italian. First Maximus of Gladiator. Then all he wants to do is go back to his farm with his family, his kids. And Garibaldi, a true gladiator for Italy, again achieves national unification largely through his fighting and then giving in to Cavour, but then goes and back to his farm for a more simple life. So go in favor of Piedmont, Sardinia. So again, Cavour is going to realpolitik. He's going to react to Garibaldi and say, well, that's not what I want. He's going to throw his weight around. Luckily, the plebiscites then again go in his favor. And the last thing is the last few places that are going to come into Piedmont, Sardinia are going to be after their siding with the Prussians in the Austro-Prussian War. With the Italian support, you then have those territories going to Piedmont, Sardinia. Therefore, you then have a unified Italy with Victor Emmanuel being the king. And what's so it's kind of interesting. Obviously, Cavour devoted his entire working life to building this national Italy, and I think it's within a few months, the textbook said, he winds up dying. So it's interesting that he gets to see his dream fulfilled, and then right before his death. But this is how Italy is built. Now, again, it's not this like total grassroots movement. There are things that are happening and intentional steps that are being taken in order to build this. If it had been just Garibaldi, then it would have just been a dramatic, romantic, could have been a poem, could have been a wonderful little story there. And now we get to the absolute best. I mean, this is probably my favorite individual in all of European history. I mean, Otto von Bismarck, ladies and gentlemen, he is a role model for all of us to follow, because talk about somebody who makes his own destiny, who has a goal and intentionally sets a plan and does whatever he needs to do in order to get it. And it's Otto von Bismarck who is going to be the poster child for this idea of realpolitik, for this idea of taking practical measures, not always honest measures, but taking practical measures to whatever is going to get what he wants in the end. And sometimes that means changing alliances, sometimes that means completely going against what you're doing, sometimes that means lying. And Otto von Bismarck is just a fascinating and brilliant politician. And he's one of those individuals who you could tell everything he did to absolute excess. He was, I think, 6'4", around 275 pounds. He was a big dude. He was known for eating huge quantities of food. It's been said that he would consume bottles of, and that's with an S, bottles of wine with a meal, which just sounds insane. He even invented a little contraption that allowed him to smoke multiple cigars at a time. I mean, one cigar is not enough. So this individual just did everything to excess, and he was born into an aristocratic Junker family within Prussia. He had his life in public service, but he didn't like taking orders from people, and so he winds up retreating for a while, and then he gets back into it. And because he would cause so much of a problem, what the Prussian government does is they actually send him to the German Confederation to be a representative, largely because they wanted him out of local politics. And then he becomes the ambassador to France, to Russia, and so he gets to learn how to analyze other leaders and their strengths and their weaknesses. And he's one of these just fascinating individuals who wasn't very popular because he would just sit down at a meal and again, bottles of wine, and he would just tell you how he felt. He would tell you exactly what he wants. After a few drinks, he would talk about German unification, and that's what he wanted, but he doesn't want unification from this grassroots, like, we're a nation, we're together. No, he wants to expand Prussian strength at the expense, of course, of anybody else. And so Otto von Bismarck, and it's even great the way he gets named Chancellor of Germany, right? Because King Wilhelm is going to want, King Wilhelm I wants to build up the Prussian military, and the only way to do that is to start making conscription mandatory. He wants to essentially institute a draft, and this is something that liberal-minded individuals within Germany, especially growing because of German industrialization, aren't going to necessarily want, and they don't especially want to see the conservative order gaining more and more power. And so the king is in this awful situation where the parliamentary system is saying no, but he wants this, and so he appoints Otto, who just essentially does it and doesn't even bother with the legislature. He's like, Reichstag who? Bundesrat. He doesn't even care. So he just does it and says, challenge me. Oh, I love him. Gosh, he's so great. One of my favorite stories about Otto is, I don't know if it was wife. Somebody asked him one morning, "How did you sleep?" And his response was, "I hated through the night." What a guy! I mean, what a dude! Who needs to sleep when you can stay up all night hating? Gosh, it's just, I hope to be him one day. Gosh, he's great. So again, when we look at the building of Germany, he is somebody who is saying it's not going to be built by nationalist movements or by liberal ideology. It is going to be, Germany is going to be built by iron and blood, and that is exactly how that happens. And it's this idea of realpolitik that you'll see the way that Germany is built. Now again, we saw the failure of 1848. There was no German nation. There was this disagreement between Kleindeutsch and Großdeutsch. Essentially, who's in power here? Is it going to be Prussia? Is it going to be Austria? Are Austrians really Germans? And how does that necessarily look? Now, what also is going on in the background is that after 1848, by the middle of the 19th century, and really by the end of the 19th century, by the time Germany becomes a nation, Germany is going to become the most industrialized nation. They are going to surpass even the British in industrialization. And that's largely, and thanks to Harrison's wonderful presentation last week, he described the Zollverein, right? While Germany wasn't politically unified, economically it was. They're reducing trade barriers. They're creating more liberal policies, allowing for trade and industry to boom in Germany. So while you have this conservative order, you also have a heavily industrialized Germany that is economically powerful. And so the conservatives, especially like Otto von Bismarck, this ultra-conservative, wants to have this top-down approach to unification. He doesn't want to see it coming from a grassroots, so he wants to build it. And one of the first ways that he does it is he goes and looks at territory in Denmark, especially territory of the Schleswig-Holstein. And the Schleswig-Holstein is going to be a territory in Denmark that really had a lot of Germans. In fact, one of them, I think it's Schleswig, I can't remember which one, but one of them has fully German speakers. The other has about 50% of German speakers. And again, part of this nationalism, a government should represent the people. They want those territories into German control. They want to be part of that German confederation. So they unify up with Austria and fight a war with Denmark in order to get the Schleswig-Holstein. But here's the deal. Otto von Bismarck, sure, wants to gain that territory. Sure, you're building nationalism. But what he's also doing is he's creating a scenario in which there could be conflict with Austria, because Austria gets control over one and Prussia gets control over the other. And he's going to use this as an example, or as a reason to then fight a war with Austria. That's two German nations fighting each other. Now, this is the war that was pretty much coming, because since the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian, well, Austrian Empire, no, this part, at this point, is beginning to fall apart, especially internally with the revolutions of 1848, the decline of Metternich. I mean, they're beginning to really fall apart, and this is where Otto von Bismarck is sensing an opportunity. And so he fights this Austro-Prussian war, which essentially gets, and they absolutely whoop the Austrians. Again, the Junkers, the conservative military, the military powerhouse that is Germany, not to mention also the incredible amounts of railways and their advanced military technology, is going to help the Prussians defeat the Austrians. And this gives Prussian supremacy in northern Germany. Now, of course, the southern German states are still independent, but in northern Germany, that becomes Prussian territory. So Germany is starting to be built. But you still have those Catholic southern states who are kind of being a little pesky here. They're just not joining in as much as they want. Clearly, Prussia is now on top within the German states, within Central Europe at least, but there's still not this unified Germany, and Otto wants more. And so, what does he then do? Well, he actually goes ahead and finds himself another wonderful excuse to fight another war. And this is really interesting. When you have the Hohenzollern family within Germany is offered the throne of Spain. And King Wilhelm actually says to the Hohenzollern, do not take this. And so they have a refusal of that, and you then see the French king is very upset with this because they're trying to negotiate this. They're trying to essentially they're trying to help facilitate this, and he then see Otto encouraging the French to ask again, ask them to take the throne of Spain one more time, and they do. And again, there's this refusal, there's this disagreement, and then the French ambassador, crown. I mean, it might have actually been the king. It might have been Napoleon. Sends a telegram over to King Wilhelm. Otto von Bismarck steals it, doctors it, and then takes it to the Junker nobility and says that France is essentially offending our emperor and is offending Germany and is declaring war. So he literally creates a war out of nothing just to fight France. Yes! And you then see the Franco-Prussian War, which is going to gain back that territory of the Alsace-Lorraine. Alsace-Lorraine causes so much war within Europe and so much bloodshed. God! But the Alsace-Lorraine comes into Prussian territory. The southern Catholic Germans are actually going to, on their own, choose to join the Prussians because they see the supremacy of the Prussians not only over Central Europe, but now over France as well. And this is the best part, is that they're signing the peace treaty in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. And in the Palace of Versailles is when King Wilhelm is crowned Emperor of Germany, where he is crowned Kaiser. What a slap in the face to the French, right? Just, right in the Hall of Mirrors, this place that is supposed to be the quintessential French palace. You now see this German victory, not only over the French, but now this unification, a new emperor being crowned, and it is just glorious. Apparently there were multiple rounds of applause as you start to see a unified Germany. So again, Italy and Germany, those are two examples of realpolitik, about politicians practicing realism in that they are taking advantage of whatever they need to in order to gain what they want. Both wanted unification, and both are going to, not slowly in some ways, but slowly, step by step, do whatever they need to do in order to achieve their aim. Sometimes that means fighting with your friends. Sometimes that means lying to your king and starting a war for absolutely no reason. Gosh, Otto. And so this is essentially the creation of these, and again, the practice of realpolitik. So how does this then play into your supplemental assignment for this week? Well, your supplemental assignment, DBQ, is all about the practice of realpolitik by Otto von Bismarck in Germany. And this is where I want you to use the section in chapter 23 about how Otto is running Germany. Now that Otto von Bismarck has built Germany, how is he going to then create this nation of Germany? What is he going to do? Who's he going to side with? How is the government going to be? How is he going to deal with all of the massive changes that are happening because of industrialization? So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to use this time to actually practice doing what a DBQ practice doing a DBQ. So I want you to go through steps 1 through 4 in about 15 minutes if you can. There are going to be 7 documents. You can see the instructions here, and then you can see the prompt there. And then, of course, you go through the 7 documents, go around the horn, and try to do that in 15 minutes. When you're done going through in 15 minutes, what I'd like you to do then is you're not gonna necessarily write it all out, but what you are going to do is you are going to do the skills involved. So I want you to group the documents in at least 3 ways and how it responds to the prompt. Again, the prompt being whether Otto von Bismarck's government represented traditional conservatism or a new kind of conservatism. Again, is it conservatism like it was practiced in the beginning of the 19th century, or is it something new, something maybe more realpolitik, as he's dealing with all of these different issues? So I want you to group it in at least 3 ways. That means by the way, remember, each group must contain more than 1 document. So I don't want a group being a single document. Try to find connections that have at least more than 1 document in it. Then you're going to do step 5.5. Instead of going right on to 6 and writing your essay, I just want you to organize it. But I do want you to do a little bit more practice. So I want you to write a thesis statement, comprehensive, John Mayer it, please. Then I want you to just choose one of the arguments in your thesis and write me a body paragraph. So that means give me a topic sentence, give me evidence from the documents. I want you to use whatever documents prove that argument. For at least one of those documents, I want you to do a hip check. Then I want you to end the body paragraph with an analysis statement explaining why your argument makes sense. So that's how you do this first supplemental assignment. Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining me in my wonderful garage. Until next time, opt it all out.